Welcome back to One Piece Explained. Chapter 1154 and 1155 formally turned the Herald flashback that was originally the Loki flashback into the Rocks flashback, something that we've all waited for so long, and I'm itching to get into it. This is probably the longest manga breakdown I've ever done on the channel, so get comfortable. We'll be starting out with Chapter 1154, Can't Even Die, and transitioning into Chapter 1155, The Rocks Pirates, which will take up most of the breakdown as there are a ton of lore reveals in that chapter, so let's get into it. We kick things off with our 38th entry in the Ogre Child Yamato's Golden Harvest Surrogate Pilgrimage cover story, and this is where things are starting to get interesting. Yamato is seen eating once again, a recurring bit throughout this cover story to really emphasize how much better off Wano is doing after Kaido and Orochi's rule. Specifically, Yamato's eating an apple, which is fitting given that it is the namesake of the region that they are in, Ringo. Page 1 walks alongside them, while Ulti is enjoying herself in the snowy region, rolling up a large snowball, and we find that Ocho and Kiku are showing them the grave of a hero that was born in the West Blue and raised in Ringo. Now, when it comes to heroes from Ringo, the first person that comes to mind is of course Ryuma, the legendary samurai from Wano, whose corpse we first met back during the Thriller Bark arc. He was laid to rest in Ringo after his death, until Gecko Moria ransacked the grave 23 years prior. The biggest issue with this grave belonging to Ryuma, however, is that Ryuma, as far as we know, was not born in the West Blue. Now, it is possible that his parents may have traveled outside Wano and given birth to him while in the West, since it seemed like Ryuma lived during a time when Wano was not totally isolated like it is today. Some may even think this is an attempt by Oda to make the events of Monsters canon, since Ryuma is found in a village that is very European or Western inspired, unlike the land of Wano. But that would have required Ryuma to have been born in the West, returned to Ringo to be raised, and then left once again, which yes is possible, but feels like it requires a lot of extra steps. It should be noted that we already saw what Ryuma's grave was supposed to have looked like with the shrine at the top of a hill in the northern cemetery, which looks very different from what we are seeing here. In the volume 110 SBS, we learned a little bit about the background of Vice Admiral Fujitora, also known by his given name, Isho. He was said to have lived on Soja Island in the West Blue before joining the Marines. However, he was initially born in the Grand Line and had previously been in charge of the military of the Aoi Kingdom. Given that he was not actually born in the West Blue, it seems unlikely for this to be about him as well, especially since he is in fact alive in the present day, though it is somewhat interesting that his outfit as a child is almost identical to what we saw Ryuma was wearing. Of the characters that we know from the West Blue, the one I think is the most likely to be this hero may actually be another zombie from Thriller Bark, Jigoro. He was a master swordsman who slayed 7,000 pirates to protect his family, and it follows that he was born in the West Blue, raised in Ringo, and then taken out of the country by Gecko Moria when he ransacked Ryuma's grave. Of course, Oda could end up surprising us by bringing in new information for characters we already met, or perhaps even introducing a new character altogether. In any case, I'm looking forward to where we go with this cover story, so with that said, let's get into Chapter 1154, Can't Even Die. We start the chapter off at 63 years ago and revisit some scenes from Big Mom's flashback, where she killed Chief Yorl during a rampage through the western village. These panels are nearly identical to what we saw back during the Whole Cake Island arc, and we had learned this tragedy was believed to be part of Loki's curse earlier in this arc. It's there that we were also told of various natural disasters that ravaged Elbaf, which we see in this chapter included fires, rough winds, and harsh winters. All of this led to a great famine, forcing the people of Elbaf to take their survival into their own hands, as we see some giants consider taking to the sea to pillage humans just as they once did in the past before Herald's attempts at reformation. It's a bit hard to tell because of the snow, but some of the buildings that we see here resemble the ones that we saw in the Craftsman village. Inter-village tensions rose to an all-time high as well, with the various villagers attacking one another, and we also learned the idea of Loki's curse spread by way of rumor throughout the villages. This helps reconcile some of the potential contradictions that had arisen when we initially learned that the people of Elbaf thought Loki to have been bad luck, since we saw them celebrating his birth back during Big Mom's flashback. It would seem that their attitude toward Loki changed over time as these atrocities struck. All of this leads to a cruel and gruesome scene where we find one of the giants at their limits down in the fisherman's village. He tries to place the responsibility on Hyrule and offers him as a sacrifice for these dark times, a scene that's reminiscent of the Shandians during the Skypiea flashback, where they believed in offering up a tribute to their gods to change their fortune. Thankfully, Herald arrives just in time and puts an end to this foolishness. The way he strikes down here is very similar to how Luffy took down Bellamy with a single blow back during the Jaya arc, and it would seem that Herald had heard about the trying times back home while he was abroad, and was able to make use of the alliances he forged with various nations to bring aid to his people. Unfortunately, Esther did not relent on blaming the country's turmoil on Loki, and she continued doing so until her death, which we learned earlier in the arc was just 1 year after Loki's birth. Even beyond her death, Loki would bear the pain of his mother's hatred, being forced to hide his eyes even from his own father. Despite Harold's benevolent nature, it seems he was a bit negligent with Loki and far too trusting of the adults that he surrounded Loki with. While Harold was busy restoring and reuniting Elbaf with the branch route system, which had been teased earlier in the arc with the 8th route, Loki continued in his twisted development as overseen by Estrid's brother. Within 15 years of his birth, he seemingly killed the lucky horse, Asla, as well as Estrid's brother, almost as if removing from the world anything that was affiliated with his mother. Meanwhile, Hyriden continued to grow alongside his mother Ida, who we learn is the one who established the tavern on the shore that we first met Colin and Mato in back during the Egghead arc. Just as that scene had echoed Luffy at the bar in Chapter 1, this one does as well. Ida's apron looks like it might read grog, which follows since she runs the tavern, and I really like the design of the barrel with the axe handle. We also learn that this area is safe from the beasts, despite being in the underworld itself, and Ida mentions Hyriden's training with Elbow. This is a new character that we've yet to meet, and it makes me wonder what happened to Hyriden's previous instructor from 63 years ago, Rydeen. We had initially seen him as part of the Giant Warrior Pirates back during the Little Garden flashback. This brings us to 56 years ago, as we find Jarl conversing with Harold at his home. It seems that Jarl does not live in any of the villages, much like how we saw Ripley and Gabon's house was elsewhere on the trunk of the Atom Tree. However, it looks like Jarl's house is located on an island cloud instead. I wonder if this could suggest anything about the other potential elders of Elbaf and whether or not they live up in a higher region, perhaps even the astral realm on top of the tree. We learned that Harold had attended the reverie of that year, not as a guest, but instead under the guise of a guard of a fellow royal. The government did not take too kindly to Harold's presence, and he only managed to escape because of another incident that took place, which we find out at the end of the chapter was the murder of a Marine admiral. Jarl chastises Harold for being needlessly reckless and hints at a long history of animosity between humanity and giant kind. This was brought up recently in the previous arc by Warkery when he clashed against Dory and Brogy. Harold also mentions the Galela Band, a legendary group of giant shipwrights, including ancient giants that travel the seas. It's revealed that they were eventually captured and never seen from again, but it's rumored that there's an army of giants frozen somewhere in the world. Now, first and foremost, the Galela Band is written and pronounced very similar to the Galela Company, the organization of shipwrights founded by Water 7's mayor Iceberg. It feels like it cannot be pure coincidence that both of these groups are skilled, renowned shipwrights, which may mean Iceberg could have some insight into the history of these giants. Could they have been part of the original founding of Water 7? I mean, after all, the ancient weapon Pluton was constructed there before being relocated to Wano. There have long been theories about the ancient giant oars, whose epithet was the continent Polar, and how the ancient giants may have been responsible for creating what would become the modern-day Wano by pushing together various islands or land masses. It also makes a lot of sense that Elbaf had great expertise in shipmaking after having just seen their skill in seafaring just a chapter or so ago with Harold. What's more interesting, though, is the hidden group of frozen giants, which likely is alluding to what we saw back in the Punk Hazard arc with the frozen hall of the Third Research Institute. There we saw plenty of giants encased in ice, several of which bear a striking resemblance to the Galela Band portrayal in this chapter. Furthermore, one of these giants even seemed to have a tattoo eerily resembles the Galela Company logo. We first learned in the Punk Hazard arc that the world government had been researching gigantification for centuries, and that their efforts eventually produced the numbers, the artificial ancient giants that we saw in Wano after having been sold to Kaido. It seems rather likely that the Galela Band was the basis for much of this research. Now, this group could also be the answer to a question that had been lingering ever since the end of the Fisherman Island arc, when the Sea Kings took the ship of Promise Noah to the Sea Forest and mentioned that they would need someone or some people's help to fix it. Given the size of the ship, it makes a lot of sense that the Galela Band may have been responsible for its construction back during ancient times. Harold took the group to have been pure myth, which may also serve to explain why he used the hammer as a child, perhaps being inspired by their might, but this could also be why Loki would end up preferring to use the hammer in present day as well. Speaking of, we also get this sequence of Loki causing havoc in the Western Village, directly in contrast to Harold's efforts at making peace and bettering their infrastructure. Earlier in the arc, we were told that Loki befriended and commanded over the underworld beasts at a young age and used them to attack the villages, which we see on full display here in this chapter. Behind him is the Mammoth Dents, the Del Kong, the Desoku or Centipede Snake, all animals that we had seen with him at the start of the arc in the present day, but also present here is the Fat Lion. As mentioned in previous breakdowns, these are all animals that were originally designed for the One Piece film Strong World and reused again for Elbaf, as explained to us by Oda in the recent Volume 112 SBS. We also see what looks like a Wintersaurus, the moose-like dinosaur that Hyruden and Stanson were seen carrying upon their introduction to this arc, and another dark wolf-like creature is shown as well. This may be a younger version of the maned wolf that we saw in present day. This leads to Hyruden confronting Loki as he echoes a line that Ida had said to Harold earlier about how being born big does not make you special, but of course, this does not resonate as much with the young prince. Loki taunts and attacks Hyruden, and it seems the royal guards join in and cheer as well. We had seen a similar flashback scene earlier in the arc, and behind him were these other silhouetted figures, and back then, I surmised that these were Loki's followers, perhaps even the same ones that would accompany him later in life when he met Lola, but it turns out these are actually royal guards, which makes their bashing of Hyruden even worse, though they do try to reel Loki in a little bit. Hyruden is then consoled by his childhood friends, Gerd, Stanton, and Goldberg. Roto is missing, as it seems Hyruden may not have befriended him just yet, while Loki is left all alone to wallow in his rage. He sees people all around him gain the affection of their loved ones, and this seems to truly be his soft spot. Even though the narrator said he lost the will to love at an early age, it's still what he desires the most at this point in life, to the point of trying to take his own. It is seen very reminiscent of Kaido's introduction in the manga. This also calls back to the start of this arc, when we got that flashback of Robin after Ohara being driven to contemplate taking her own life on that cliff. Much like Kaido, Loki was born too durable to succumb to any wounds from such a fall, just as he survived as a newborn. Now, as he wishes his life would come to an end, a new reason to continue living would appear before him as we get the surprise introduction of the Rock's pirates. After having been teased in silhouette for over 6 years, we finally get the reveal of Rox D. Zebek, and he looks extremely familiar as we're told that he's the father of Blackbeard. A lot to talk about here, so let's start from the beginning. We first got a hint of the existence of the Rock's pirates back during the Reverie arc when we saw several Marines discussing the contact between Big Mom and Kaido. Hina cited them as the reason Garp was considered a Marine hero, which prompted Garp to mention Rox by name and express surprise that Hina knew about them. At the time, this exchange was very mysterious, with the suggestion being made that Kaido and Big Mom were once on a crew together over 40 years ago with some unknown captain. We would formally learn of the Rock's pirates later on during the middle of the Wano arc, when we were told that Rox D. Zebek's pirate crew consisted of modern-day legends, including Whitebeard, Big Mom, Kaido, Shiki, Captain John, and a few characters that at the time had yet to be revealed, such as the Silver Axe or Wang Ji. This was also our first tease of the God Valley incident, in which Vice Admiral Garp had to team up with Gold Roger to fight against the Rock's pirates. We learned that he was perhaps Roger's greatest enemy, and that he broke many of the world's taboos to the point of his existence being covered up to the world at large. We would get another silhouetted glimpse of him later on during the Wano arc, when Kaido began to compare Luffy's potential to the likes of other powerful pirates that he had known in his life, and there, many took his depiction to be very reminiscent of Monkey D. Dragon, an idea that was somewhat bolstered by the fact that Dragon had also been considered the world's worst criminal a long time ago. Of course, that theory did not pan out. We first saw our glimpse of the God Valley incident during Kuma's flashback in the previous arc, where we got a look at several new members of the Rock's pirates, and our first bit of dialogue from Rox himself, albeit off-screen, and we'll touch back on this in just a bit. Now, the elephant in the room is, of course, Zebek's likeness to Blackbeard, and Oda doesn't let this linger as a mystery either, with him directly telling us that they are father and son. This was a possibility that many of us considered for years now, just off the basis of cyclical parallels and ideas of inherited will that you often see in shonen manga. This connection was also made much more tangible when we first learned that Blackbeard's main ship was known as the Saber of Zebek, as revealed to us in Road to Laugh Tale Volume 1, a series published in Shonen Jump during a month-long break toward the climax of the Wano arc, that included sketches alongside comments from Shonen Jump editors and staff. This suggested that Blackbeard was aware of Zebek's existence in some form, which made a lot of sense given his interest in the past, as told to us in Volume 82's SPS, where Blackbeard was said to be interested in gambling and studying history, as well as Volume 88's SPS, where it was said that his real-life career would be in archaeology. Now, Blackbeard is 40 years old in present day, meaning at this point in the flashback, we are 8 years before his birth, and to paint the picture even further, this means he was born 2 years before the God Valley incident, where Rox allegedly met his demise. We learned from one of Blackbeard's Reverie cards that he was born on a place called Shade Port, located on an island somewhere in the Grand Line. Not much else is known about this place just yet, but it does play into Blackbeard's powers thematically, with him having the Darkness Fruit, much like how Luffy being born on Dawn Island is in line with him having the Fruit of the Sun God. We would learn that he was an orphan during the Oden flashback when he asked to join the Whitebeard Pirates, and it's not clear if the island that we saw in that scene was supposed to be Shade Port, though his depiction back then does match what we saw when Oda drew the warlords as children back during the Volume 63 SPS. There, we saw a young Blackbeard crying under the moon, which ties back to this exchange between a young Buggy and Shanks upon first seeing Blackbeard as a child during that Oden flashback. There, Buggy claimed that Blackbeard has never slept once in his life. This line was very reminiscent of what we assumed to be a throwaway line between Luffy and Sanji back during the Drum Island arc, where Luffy claimed that people from Winter Islands don't sleep, citing it back to something that he had heard in a village tavern long ago, which would have likely been from Shanks and the Red Hair Pirates in Makino's bar. This is particularly interesting given that our first hint at Blackbeard's existence was in the Drum Island arc, where he was said to have attacked the island for reasons that are still unknown to this day. Now, the implications of this reveal are quite vast, and it certainly recontextualizes a lot of what we know so far. For one, Shanks' pursuit of Blackbeard is even more interesting if he had known about Blackbeard's lineage this whole time, and this could even swing things back in the other direction with that scene during the Reverie of what we initially thought was Shanks coming to talk to the elders about a certain pirate. With the recent reveal of Shamrock, we began to think that this might have been him approaching the elders instead, as it makes more sense for a holy knight to have an audience with the elders than a pirate emperor like Shanks, but given the magnitude of Blackbeard's lineage, it could be that he approached them to give them everything he knows about Blackbeard. This is also somewhat bolstered by Saturn's acknowledgement of Blackbeard's special bloodline, as mentioned to Katarina Devon and Von Augur back during the Egghead arc. They expressed some surprise that the Elder knew about what would be the connection between Blackbeard and Zebek, and they restated their crew's goal, the world, which was exactly what Zebek was after back in his day. This reveal also explains why Blackbeard was among that group of cut-up posters and photos held by Emu. Luffy, of course, is in possession of Joy Boy's fruit, while Shirahoshi is the legendary mermaid princess, also known as the ancient weapon Poseidon. Vivi is the descendant of Lily, who betrayed Emu in the distant past, and now Blackbeard is the child of the man who posed a direct threat to Emu with his ambition to become the king of the world, Roxy Zebek. This does bring into question, how did nobody make the connection between Rox and Blackbeard given their near identical facial features, especially someone like Whitebeard, who was on cruise with both the father and the son? Well, it's plausible that Whitebeard knew or realized over time, but simply did not care. We've seen him express across multiple instances that he did not care about the circumstances of his crew's birth, and that he believed children should not bear the sins of their fathers, which is why he took in Ace despite Roger being his former enemy. As for the Marines, the government, and the world at large, it probably helped a lot that much of Zebek's existence was covered up, meaning that even if people knew of his name, it's far less likely that they knew what he looked like. On top of this, it was said that Blackbeard had hid under Whitebeard's shadow, which allowed him to plot his schemes while not gaining any attention nor receiving a formal bounty. In fact, Blackbeard was so much of an unknown to the point where Vice Admiral Suru was more familiar with his underling Lafitte and his track record as a policeman. Of course, it seems he took the name of what we presume to be his mother, going by Marshall D. Teach as opposed to Rox D. Teach, to hide his true identity, should he have even known it. This is exactly what Ace had done, abandoning his father's name and taking his mother's, Portgas. Speaking of, this also adds some more color to Blackbeard and Ace's clash on Bonaro Island, creating a more distinct parallel to Zebek and Roger's rivalry. Not only that, both God Valley and Bonaro are islands marked by their distinct rock formations, and both seem to be inspired by Wild West settings with their architecture, reinforcing this connection even further. However, while rocks allegedly fell on God Valley, it would be Ace that met his defeat on Bonaro. Now, the other interesting detail we get with this reveal is that Rox is not yet the captain of the Rox Pirates at this point in time, so it seems his band of rogues is not a formal pirate crew just yet. There is quite a lot more to talk about with Zebek, including a potential connection to another Emperor of the Sea, but I'll get into that in just a bit when we talk about the reveals in 1155. Before we get to that, let's go through who he brought with him to Elbaf. First and foremost, we have a young Whitebeard who would be 26 years old at this point in time. We had learned that Whitebeard grew up on Sphinx Island as an orphan and watched his country live in poverty due to the difficulties that came with not being able to have the government's protection. In an effort to make his people's lives better, he became a pirate himself and sent his spoils back to his village, which is likely why someone as kind-hearted as him found himself working with Rox, though given what we learned in 1155, it seems this may not have entirely been his choice. It should also be noted that the flashback we got upon Whitebeard's death in Marineford, where he reminisced about his time as a younger pirate, looks to have been before he joined Rox, as evidenced by his lack of facial hair at that point in time. Beside him is a young Shiki equipped with his twin blades, Oto and Kogarashi, that he would later affix on his severed legs when escaping from Impel Down. Not much is known about Shiki's early days, nor do we know how old he actually was at any point in the story. However, we do know that he once came in contact with Kurozomi Higurashi, who was able to take his likeness with her clone fruit. We first saw this during her meeting with the young Orochi, which took place 41 years ago, 7 years after this point in the current flashback. Now, because of this, for a long time, we speculated that Higurashi may have met the Rox pirates or even sailed among them, since she had been able to touch Shiki in order to gain his appearance, on top of the fact that she also approached Kaido 28 years ago and persuaded him to help reclaim Wano by displacing the Kozuki family. Higurashi had claimed to have left Wano at some point, perhaps even having been among the group who left Wano 55 years ago, along with some of the Shimotsuki family. So it could be that she came into contact with Shiki and the rocks at any point between 55 and 41 years ago, before returning to Wano. But what makes things a little more interesting is that the appearance of Shiki she takes on 41 years ago in front of Orochi is that of a younger Shiki, with shorter hair, and as we see in this chapter, Shiki had already grown out his hair at least 7 years prior to that. So what this likely means is that Higurashi had come into contact with Shiki even before he joined up alongside Rocks, and given Shiki's wardrobe throughout the series, it may have been possible that he himself was from Wano, and if we take things a step further, him having met Higurashi in his youth could suggest that he himself is a Kurozumi. This is of course a bit speculative, but it does follow if both Shiki and Higurashi fled Wano together as part of that group 55 years prior. It's also somewhat interesting that the Kozuki clan had a prophecy that would come to fruition 20 years in the future after their defeat to Kaido and Orochi, while Shiki also had a similar plan that would take around 20 years to come to fruition. That plan was what we saw in the movie Strong World, but it should be noted that for the most part, the events of films are not canon, so in the continuity of the manga, Shiki is still out there with a plan that could come into play at any point in the modern day. While many of the creatures that we saw in Strong World were the product of Mervale's special IQ plant that prompted a particular evolution in plants and animals, most of them were not shown in Chapter 0, allowing that continuity to be intact. However, in this chapter, we did get the presence of the Fat Lion, which can be seen in that panel of Mervale, so maybe this may not necessarily be true anymore. But all of that is beside the point. It makes sense that Shiki and Whitebeard were some of Rox's early recruits, just given how influential they ended up being after Rox disbanded. Shiki even clashed with Roger at the Battle of Ed War, where he extended to Roger the offer to take the world alongside him, a goal that he likely inherited from his former captain, Rox. Now the last member of this crew appears to what we can presume to be Buckingham Stussy, who at the time would have been around 28 years old. Not much is known about her past just yet, but of course, we would see that she had an affinity for Whitebeard by the time of the we saw that she had an affinity for Whitebeard by the time the events of God Valley came around about 10 years later. She also seems to be wielding a weapon of some sort, perhaps a blade or a staff, or maybe even a firearm like she was shown holding during her time in Mads. This brings us to chapter 1155, where we see the scene continue to play out. Loki sits up amongst the shattered ground and broken trees that were the result of his fall from the Sun World, as Zebek questions him about Harold's location. Loki refuses to follow orders given to him by a puny human, a stance not unlike what we saw from Roto earlier in the arc, so in order to persuade Loki into listening, he delivers a hockey-infused strike at the young giant so that he would be forced to call for the return of his father, who we learned in the previous chapter was out on an expedition. Actually, this makes me wonder if this expedition could have been the same one Goldberg mentioned earlier, where his father was among a group of people that set out to vanquish Big Mom. She would have been around 20 years old at this point, having had her first child Prospero at the age of 18. We know Linlin was recruited within the next 4 years, as she was already with Rox when Kaido joined at the age of 15, 44 years prior to present day, and we know she had already become a great threat to the world as a pirate while she was still a child, so it's likely that Rox sought her out from just that alone, but I wonder if her relationship to Elbaf could have been a factor. Perhaps Rox would learn about Linlin's monstrous power at just the age of 5 and would then be interested in using that for his own goals, or maybe it goes even further and Harold wished for Rox to take her down in exchange for his eventual allegiance. Now, getting back on track, this is not the first time that we've seen Rox harm Loki, as about 10 chapters ago, we saw Rox stab the child when he asked to join their crew. This scene likely takes place a bit later on in this flashback, perhaps when Rox is getting ready to depart Elbaf, and Rox impaling Loki in that scene is a bit interesting given what we learned from this chapter, with the narrator telling us that Rox's swordsmanship was rather infamous for dealing damage akin to a cannonball or giant hammer, which again gives us a potential source of inspiration for Loki's preference for the use of Ragnir. The stance that we see Rox take here is very reminiscent of what we saw from Roger during his clash with Whitebeard, and the implication seems to be that he imbued his blade with Conqueror's Haki to attack Loki, which is honestly a bit overkill, but it shows just how durable Loki is to be able to survive an attack like that even as a child. I've also been waiting for this opportunity to talk about the mountain that we saw sliced in the previous chapter. At the time, there was a lot of speculation that this was the work of Rox, and given that we did not see his blade on him in that scene, I saw many online speculations that this was the product of Devil Fruit powers. The idea that he was the previous user of the Opop fruit went around, with many mistaking his hand gesture as the one we see Law use for his techniques, although it's quite clear that he's simply just holding up 2 fingers since he's asking Loki 2 questions. Others speculated that he may have the Chop Chop fruit and was displaying an awakened ability to separate things outside of his body, a theory that was further propagated propagated by his potential likeness to Buggy, which I'll touch on in just a bit. But now that we've seen his swordsmanship stated as being incredibly destructive, I have some doubts that the mountain being cleanly sliced through was his work, and instead think it was likely the product of Shiki's blades or Whitebeard's naginata. This then takes us back to the incident at the Reverie 56 years prior that we first heard about in the previous chapter, as we get an incredible scene of Rox casually sitting in the Chamber of Flowers with his gun drawn behind Emu. It would seem that Rox had not only killed an admiral, but also abducted 5 kings to get to this point, but as it turns out, his plans would not amount to anything, as Emu didn't care about the value of those lives in the first place. This scene is rather cryptic, as it seems Rox didn't do anything else after this aside from escaping, almost as if he knew that he was powerless against Emu, but he does vow that he'll return one day. Perhaps the most interesting aspect of the scene, however, is the potential reveal that the nameless silhouetted servant before Emu was none other than Gunko. We first saw this person back in chapter 908 as they announced to Emu that the elders had arrived. It was always weird that there was someone other than the elders that knew of Emu's existence at the time, but once the Holy Knights were established as knowing about Emu, it became a little more reasonable for other important vassals to have this knowledge. We saw this person again more recently toward the end of the Egghead arc, where they expressed concern for Emu after they had felt Joy Boy's hockey. Now, I guess we should proceed somewhat cautiously, since it's not explicitly confirmed that the servant in the present day is the same as the servant from 56 years ago. However, it would make a decent amount of sense for the same person to fulfill this role throughout the decades, and as we've seen, Gunko's appearance back then is pretty much identical to what she looks like in the present day. Her hair seemed to have been longer back then, but it should be noted that her hair grew out once Emu took possession of her, so there may be something strange going on there. By this point, it seems more than obvious that Gunko's age has been frozen similar to the elders, something that is not a given for every Holy Knight, as we know Garling has grown into his old age, so this special privilege coming from her role as Emu's close attendant seems very plausible. But this proximity to Emu makes Gunko's relationship with Brooke, and whoever her father was, even more confusing, especially when you take into account the recent updates found in Volume 112, where Gunko's introduction was updated to refer to her as the Manmeyer family's Saint Gunko. This definitely changes the trajectory of all those weeks of speculation that we had since her introduction, and now makes us wonder if she had been a celestial dragon during her whole life, which would mean that Brooke may have had a similar affiliation. Could his role as a knight for his kingdom actually have been in reference to his role as a holy knight at Mary Joa? Seems like a hard truth to swallow. Or is it possible that Gunko was simply taken in from an outside country through adoption or abduction and given this special status, something that we believe to be possible given the elders' negotiations with York and the Holy Knight's offer to Loki? We'll just have to see. In either case, it is somewhat interesting that if Shamrock was the one that visited the elders back during the Reverie arc, both Gunko and Shamrock would have been introduced in the same arc prior to their formal introductions in Elbaf. As Rox makes his escape, he comes across Harold covered in flames. Now, in the previous chapter, we learned that Rox had killed an admiral, which means that at least one of them were stationed there for the Reverie, not unlike what we saw with Fujitora and Ryokugyu during the recent one in the present day. Given this rank's propensity to be filled with Logia users, it makes me wonder if the flames on Harold were the product of an admiral who was the previous user of the flame fruit. And this begs the question, who exactly were the admirals at this point in time? Well, the only people that have been explicitly stated to be former admirals that we know of are Kuzan, Sakazuki, and Sengoku. Kuzan and Sakazuki were of course part of the 3 admirals before the time skip and defected and got promoted respectively afterwards. Plus, the 2 of them were not even born yet when this incident happened. Sengoku was shown to be an admiral as far back as 27 years ago during this clash between Roger and Shiki. However, 56 years ago, incidentally, was when he, alongside Garp and Suru, first joined the Marines. People also like to point to Zephyr, the non-canon former admiral from Film Z, but even if he was being adapted into the main story, he would not have been an admiral at this point in time, since he would have been only 18, and it was said he became an admiral at the age of 38. Then we have Kong, who I suspected to have been an admiral at least 38 years ago during the events of God Valley, back during my chapter 1096 breakdown. In that chapter, he's shown calling Garp from a room that resembles the same room that we saw Sengoku in during his time as an admiral during the Law and Corazon flashbacks, so check that breakdown out for more information if you're interested. Of course, Kong was the fleet admiral by the time of the Battle of Edward 27 years prior to the present day, so for at least a decade before that, he would have been an admiral. Now, is it possible for him to have been an admiral an additional 15 or so years before that? That's not entirely clear. We don't know how old Kong is supposed to be in the present day, and it's not certain just how long the average admiral tenure is. Kizaru became an admiral sometime between 15 and 4 years ago, using his appearance during the Fisher Tiger flashback when he was a vice admiral, and his appearance in the Kuma flashback as benchmarks. Both Sakazuki and Kuzan held the position of admiral for at most 22 years, and that's if you assume they were both immediately promoted after the events of Ohara. All in all, it's hard to say, and it feels like it's more likely that there were other admirals that we've yet to learn of in the past, but maybe we'll see them revisited in an SBS or a different flashback. But getting back to this chapter, Harold and Rox draw their blades and clash with what we can presume to be their advanced applications of Conqueror's Haki, with their blades seemingly not even touching. The shockwave was so powerful, it's said to have knocked out anyone in a 5-kilometer radius, which is very reminiscent of what we saw when Whitebeard and Roger clashed during the Oden flashback. Now, I'm not one to power scale, but this definitely informs what we as readers are supposed to think about these two in terms of their strength, as potentially being on Roger's level back in the day. This scene also gives us our first look at Xebec's unique laugh, Vo Ha Ha. Sometimes characters' laughs are thematic or inspired by some aspect of that character, but it's not immediately clear to me what this laugh may be getting at. If you have any ideas, I'd love to know, so feel free to leave them as a comment. While on this topic, it is a bit fun that Blackbeard's laugh, Zehahaha, could be interpreted as a nod to his father's name of Xebec, though I'm not sure if this is intentional or correct, as Xebec is more accurately pronounced as Xebec. With this brief fateful meeting, Rox points Harold toward the New World, prompting Harold to jump off the red line, and below him you can see some of the gondolas that are used to carry people and supplies up and down from the port below. Harold leaping off from heights is reminiscent of Luffy, who often enjoys doing the same thing, much to his crew's discomfort, but it also shows just where Loki got his insane durability from. On his way out, Harold declines Rox's invitation to meet again, claiming that he does not affiliate with villains. This line stood out to me, given him being a descendant of ancient giants, of which the most famous in recent history was Ors, an ancient giant who was said to have created a nation of villains himself. This is also a bit interesting when you consider the similar ambitions of both Rox and Blackbeard. After the events of that reverie, Rox became the infamous criminal known around the world. However, interestingly, his exact bounty is not revealed to us. Given his crimes, you would think that he would have been one of the most wanted men to have ever lived, but we were told back during the Wano arc that no one had surpassed the bounties of Whitebeard and Roger. Perhaps that was not the whole truth, we'll just have to see. Now, what strikes me about this photo in the first place is that this pose is somewhat similar to that of Luffy's pre-Wano bounty posters, with his hand in front of his face. Though while Luffy is seemingly waving at the camera, we can see Rox's fingers are curled up in a grabbing motion, thematically playing into his desire to claim the world. The photo does not resemble Blackbeard's bounty poster at all, but curiously, it is eerily similar to Buggy's, and a popular theory that went around in recent weeks, but has actually been a point of discussion for as long as Rox was mentioned all those years ago, that Buggy is the son of Rox. You would think this theory would have been debunked as soon as it was revealed that he was the father of Blackbeard in his prior chapter, but for some reason, this theory is now as popular as ever. Of course, the aforementioned speculation of Rox having the awakened Chop Chop fruit fueled these theories last week, but on top of that was the idea that Rox's facial expression looks like a mashup of Blackbeard and Buggy, with the wide-eyed side being Blackbeard's and the squinted side resembling Buggy's face in that cross-scaled bounty poster. And while the resemblance is certainly there, I should note that it's not like Blackbeard has not made a similar expression in the series before either. Of the four emperors, Buggy is somehow the one whose childhood is the most shrouded in mystery. Hell, we don't even know if he has a family name. Luffy aside, we have just started peeling back the layers of both Shanks and Blackbeard's lives, but for some reason, Buggy has not had yet anything of that sort. The only thing we know is that he was born a year before God Valley in the Grand Line and was with the Roger Pirates by the age of 9. And given how all of the emperors have some sort of special lineage, it would feel narratively complete if Buggy did as well, even if some would criticize the series as having too much nepotism or special parenthood tropes going on. On one hand, it would feel rather appropriate for Buggy to be a nobody that just fell upwards into this grand millennia-spanning conflict for freedom and power, but on the other hand, he was also raised by the King of the Pirates on the King of the Pirates ship, so it's not like he's a complete unknown to begin with. If he does end up having a connection to Rox, I feel like it would be pretty cool if he was in a similar situation to Shanks, having been taken in on God Valley, but from Rox's side. There's a ton of speculation to be had, and I truly enjoy Buggy as a character. His last appearance in the story really cemented the fact that he's perhaps the most piratey of the pirates at this point in the series, with him expressing his desire to claim the treasure for the treasure's sake, but we'll touch back on this in just a bit. What's particularly interesting about this expression is that Rox makes it fairly often, with him having it in nearly every panel he's in. But not only that, the eye he squints with alternates between the two, almost as if there's something else going on, perhaps some sort of muscular facial tic that cannot settle in place, something asymmetrical, not necessarily a split personality, but something uneven. And this brings us to another long-held theory throughout the fandom, Blackbeard's multiple personalities. I'm sure that you've come across this graphic at some point where it shows Blackbeard's depictions throughout the first half of the series, and personally, I don't necessarily buy into this too much. As meticulous of a mangaka as Oda is, he consistently makes a lot of design mistakes throughout the series. In fact, we actually just went through that whole absinthe craze at the start of the Elbaf arc that just turned out to be Oda making a bunch of small errors, and the reality is that that sort of thing happens all the time, but most fans just don't notice it. If you go throughout the wiki pages for every volume, you'll see a ton of errors that get fixed between the magazine version and the volume version, and there are plenty more that don't ever get caught. And it's one of those ideas that has been repeated so many times in the fandom that some people just take it to be an inevitable truth, much like how people believe the notion of smiling at death being a prerequisite to be a D, or how people think Black Lightning is exclusive to Conqueror's Hockey. All of these are popular but inaccurate beliefs that get thrown around every day, and they probably deserve their own video, but that's for some other time. Now, this Blackbeard teeth theory is predicated on the idea of Blackbeard having multiple personalities, 3 to be specific, since there's this idea that Blackbeard must be associated with things in sets of 3, since his Jolly Roger is 3 skulls. And so this graphic compiles 3 distinct depictions of Blackbeard's teeth. The original, which features 2 teeth missing up top and 1 below, another where 2 are missing on both the top and bottom, and one where he has a full set without anything missing. And I guess the idea is that he switches between personalities when he's depicted with each one, which at face value feels like a very compelling idea. But if you look even a little bit further at the chapters these images are taken from, you'll see configurations of teeth that do not line up with the ones shown here, or even differences among consecutive panels. And I'm not here to convince you one way or another, but to me, it seems more likely that these are small inconsistencies instead of Blackbeard changing his personality every other panel. And I wonder if this graphic was never updated to include post-time skip depictions of Blackbeard, since Oda is fairly consistent with him now, but that's neither here nor there. The reason I bring this theory up is that after this chapter, I do believe there may be something similar going on, just not in terms of teeth. 56 years ago, Rox declared to Emu that he would eventually be back. This sort of ominous threat really brings to mind what Roger said to Rayleigh before leaving the crew, proclaiming that he would not die, despite turning himself in for execution. I think many of us take these sorts of lines under the concept of an inherited will being passed on, and others coming forth in the future to carry out those ambitions. As Blackbeard said, people's dreams don't ever end, they just carry forward. And that's sort of what devil fruits are to begin with when you think about it. Whether Vegapunk's explanation of them being the product of people's dreams was figurative or literal, someone had a desire to have that certain ability, and that desire continued to be passed on throughout the generations for other people to carry. And while I normally would not think more of this sort of line in a regular circumstance, Xebec tells Harold later on in this chapter that all of this is just the prologue to his life, this being the plan to take full lead for himself as a pirate's paradise. I'll talk more about the specifics of this in just a bit, but given what we know so far about the state of the world and Blackbeard's schemes, this line is incredibly eerie. Blackbeard as a character is someone who professes the importance of fate and believes everything happens for a reason, so him following in his father's footsteps could easily just be taken as him carrying through on that grand plan that his father laid out ahead of time. But the way Rox speaks about all of this with such conviction makes it hard not to consider if Rox is still involved in all of this in some form. And it certainly sounds a bit too out there, and perhaps even reeks of bad tropes from other series, but I would not be surprised if we come to find out that Rox's will has continued on in Blackbeard in some form. I don't know if that would mean a split personality or what, but it could help to explain Blackbeard's strange body, as mentioned by Marco back during the Marineford arc, that somehow allows him to wield 2 devil fruit powers. There have been old Blackbeard theories that involved him having 3 hearts or souls, and I suppose all of that is still at play as well. As we approach the end of the series, I'm expecting there to be crazier and crazier events, and perhaps even some classic shonen tropes that we may or may not have loved from other series. Who knows, maybe Rox was reincarnated as a devil fruit, and if that's even possible. Or perhaps the reason for Blackbeard seeking the dark fruit was because his father had it as well, and it's through that connection that Rox is able to live on, similar to how we have been hinted that Ace lives through Sabo's flame fruit. Perhaps that metaphor is not just figurative. We'll have to find out. Before moving on to my favorite part of this chapter, I do want to mention that the final panel talks about the Rox Pirates formation causing the world to quake with terror. This verbiage feels oddly specific, considering that Whitebeard was our first known user of the Quake fruit, a power that was said to have the potential to destroy the world, and as we know, that power ended up in the hands of Blackbeard. If Blackbeard had indeed been following his father's plans to a T, could that mean that Xebec also wielded the Quake fruit before his death? It's never been made clear when exactly Whitebeard ended up acquiring his fruit, so it's somewhat possible that he acquired it after Xebec passed. Lots of interesting possibilities here, but now, let's talk about Davy Jones. After Rox's rampage through Mary Joa, we learned that he attacked the ship that was carrying the heavenly tributes to the Holy Land. If you'll recall, this was a tactic that Doflamingo was using to leverage himself into a warlord position. Rox instead took these funds and supposedly that ship in order to begin his pirating ventures, and in the process, he destroyed one of the gates of justice. These are the 3 large structures that allow passage into either Marine HQ, Impel Down, or Enia's lobby, and it makes me wonder which gate it was that he destroyed in particular. Given that the ship was headed for Mary Joa, I would guess the gate near Marine HQ, but but this also provides a great contrast between the abilities and tactics used by him and his son, as the Blackbeard pirates had to resort to hypnotizing the control room operators instead of relying on brute force. We learned that he set his sights on pirates as well, and started engaging in Davy back fights to acquire a crew of formidable fighters. This was actually a long-held theory that we had considered ever since learning that the Rock's pirates were not friendly with one another and often tried to kill each other. It feels like one of the only possible explanations for how so many discordant people could end up on the same crew, so it's amazing to see this theory pan out. Now, the Davy back fight was of course first introduced back during the Long Ring Longland arc that unfortunately some fans dislike due to the nature of how it was handled in the anime. But personally, I love this arc, and I've been waiting for so long to see it come back into play. It was initially described as a pirate game that was started on Pirate Island, which we would later learn to be Fololed, the very island that Zebek looks to claim in this chapter, where Blackbeard would roll over after the time skip. Now, using this game, pirates could take crewmates from one another, and of course, declining would be a great shame. This game is also a tribute to Davy Jones, a pirate from the distant past that was once said to have been cursed by a demon and now allegedly lives on the floor of the ocean. This is clearly inspired by the real-life legend of Davy Jones' locker, which is somewhat similar as explained by Oda in the Volume 38 SPS. Given the trajectory of the series, I would not be surprised if Davy Jones turns out to be a real figure from the olden times that inspired this game throughout the years, especially with Rox proclaiming that he was a worshipper of the figure himself. We get this brief montage of Rox partaking in the games, with the one up top being the donut race. Foul play is a natural part of these games, so it seems he claimed the victory by shooting at the opponents. It's interesting to me that these bullets resulted in such big explosions, and perhaps this is some sort of hockey technique that can increase the power of projectiles, and maybe that's what we saw with Yasop shooting the Barto Club in the previous chapters. There's also this game where Rox looks to be beheading someone with an axe. My guess is that this is the Groggy Ring game, where a player on each team is made to be the ball by fixing the ball to the top of their head, and the game below is of course combat with the final boxing match. Like I said, I'm ecstatic that we are seeing this game play more and more of an important role in the lore of the world. We did get a hint of it in the story once again in the previous arc, as we saw the reintroduction of Foxy, Porsche, and Hamburg, with the suggestion being that they lost the rest of their crew and their ship, perhaps to even more losses in the Davy back fights. And at this point, I'm kind of suspecting that the great fight for the One Piece, or one of the clashes between the emperors, will include a Davy back fight in real time. But more interesting are the wanted posters that Rox had been using to hunt down notable criminals. Some of these are a bit hard to make out, but the most evident is the one in the middle with the prominent mustache belonging to a young Edward Newgate, who would go on to of course become Whitebeard. The one above it looks to have long light hair and an evil grin. Now, considering that Whitebeard is the other one, I would gather that this is probably Shiki, but that expression also greatly resembles Higurashi as well, who I mentioned previously may have had ties to the Rox pirates. In either case, since Rox's Davy back fight run would be taking place after 56 years ago, it makes it equally feasible for Higurashi and potentially Shiki to have left Wano by this point. Who knows, maybe that ship Rox is targeting in this panel is actually the one that left Wano. Now, the one underneath Whitebeard's poster is the most difficult to interpret, but it appears to be someone in a dark hat and potentially with glasses, maybe even a beard or a mustache. The name on the poster is not very legible, but the first letter does look like it starts with the letter C, and the middle letters look like P's. Honestly, my first thought when looking at this was Capone, but of course Beige was not born yet. Though recall that Capone was the head of one of the 5 families of the West, so perhaps this could even be his father. Perhaps someone we'll see in just a bit, Don Marlin. The flashback within the flashback ends and brings us back to 48 years ago as we find the Rox crew sailing toward Elbaf. On deck are of course the 3 members that he brought with him onto the island that we saw in the last chapter, Whitebeard, Shiki, and Stussy, though there does seem to be someone else off to the right underneath the speech balloons. And if you look closely, you can see that the ship is the same one that we saw used by the Rox pirates during Kaido's brief flashback with the 3 lanterns on the back. It seems Rox's underhanded schemes did work to get Harold to return. Loki is surprised to see his father actually caring for him after having been scarred by his mother's scorn, and this brings us to an amazing spread of the Rox pirates as of 48 years ago. So going one by one, we have Shiki, who we've talked about so much so far, and most of these folks have their future epithets in parentheses below with their current occupation up top. So for Shiki, his future epithet is the Golden Lion, while his job at the top seems to have been a mobster in the English translation, but the original Japanese reads Gokudo, which is a term that describes lowlives, but can also be often used to refer to Yakuza as well, once again establishing another potential connection between Shiki and Wano. We then have Miss Buckin, and we had thought that this was merely an alias to hide her true identity in her old age, but it seems that she had always always gone by this even back then, even though we do see her referred to as Stussy later on during the God Valley incident by Gloriosa. She's referred to as a science robber, which recontextualizes her time with Mads quite a bit. Back then, her status as a freeloader had a negative connotation where she was not actively contributing anything, whereas here there's some idea that she's a skilled thief. We then have the aforementioned Don Marlin, a gangster from the West Blue. It seems rather likely that he may have been from one of the 5 families of the West, from which Capone Gang Beige is also from, and given his title, it seems he may have been the previous head of his family. As mentioned earlier, the bounty poster that we saw in that montage vaguely resembles Marlin, and if the connection is true, then this could make him Capone Marlin. Marlin's name and design is also inspired by the American actor Marlon Brando, who played Don Corleone in the Godfather movies. This takes us to Edward Newgate, who was just a mere pirate at the time, but would of course go on to gain the epithet of Whitebeard. But more interesting to me are the two beside him. We finally get the reveal of Wang Zhi. They were first mentioned back during that marine debrief for the Rock's pirates during the middle of the Wano arc as part of the crew, and once again after the end of the Wano arc, where we learned that Kobe's involvement in the Rocky Port incident allowed for Blackbeard to defeat Wang Zhi, who had been ruling Pirate Island full of lead at this time. Now, the Rocky Port incident was first mentioned back in chapter 700 when we got the laydown of the current warlords. Law was said to have orchestrated the event, but we never really got much more detail. Earlier during the Punk Hazard arc, we had learned that Law had sent 100 pirate hearts to Marine HQ in order to become a warlord, which we would eventually find out in the Egghead arc actually belonged to the pirates on Full of Lead taken during the Rocky Port incident. And Kobe's involvement was first mentioned during the Reverie arc, where he was said to have saved the lives of countless civilians. This whole event was explained in slightly more detail during a Shonen Jump Q&A session that eventually made its way into Volume 111. I'll note now that Wang Zhi may also be referred to as Ochoku, as their name could be read differently in Chinese or Japanese, given their inspiration being the Wang Zhi from our real-world history, a Chinese pirate lord from the 16th century. The Viz translation seems to have gone with the Chinese pronunciation. It says quite a lot that Wang Zhi reigned over Full of Lead up until the time skip, as that means they had been in charge since at most 38 years ago when the Rock's pirates first disbanded. Given that they weren't depicted in that panel we got during the God Valley incident in Kuma's flashback, I wonder if they stayed behind on the island and capitalized on the opportunity to claim it for themselves when Rocks fell. It also says a lot that Blackbeard was only able to take Full of Lead in the midst of such a big conflict involving Law as a third party, as well as the Marines, which could suggest Wang Zhi was quite formidable even into their old age. Not only that, but Law's decision to journey to Full of Lead in the first place has always been interesting, since they revealed that it was where Rocky Port was located. Perhaps Law had initially sought out Wang Zhi's assistance for his plans to take out Doflamingo. But anyways, Wang Zhi is said to be a pirate guru in the official translation, but the original text for guru is Kyoso, which can mean either guru or religious cult leader, and this brings us to a very interesting connection here, with Wang Zhi potentially being the parent of Caribou and his brother Korobu. At face value, you can identify a lot of similarities in their appearance, with a single strand of hair falling down their face, their pronounced lips, beady eyes, similar nose, and pointed ears, but the idea of Wang Zhi being a religious leader also ties back into Caribou's overzealous religious nature, with him praying for the souls of his enemies after killing them. This connection could also further recontextualize Caribou's affinity for Blackbeard. On one hand, it would mean Caribou is also attempting to follow in his parents' footsteps and align himself with Rox's child, or maybe things are a little more complicated, and Caribou resents Blackbeard for defeating Wang Zhi, and just had been putting on an act to get closer to him to take revenge. Or maybe things are not as drastic, and instead, he's simply looking to get to Full of Lead so he can rescue his loved one. Though I suppose Caribou has not shown to be too family-oriented, as seen from him abandoning his brother during his cover story. Caribou was the oldest of 2 brothers at the age of 32 years old, meaning Wang Zhi would have had him 6 years after the God Valley incident. And of note, we have seen what his grandmother would have looked like from his cover story, suggesting that they may not have been raised by Wang Zhi very much. Now, Wang Zhi's current status in the story is not yet confirmed, as it was not clear if Blackbeard actually killed them or not, and it's quite possible that they were simply kept as prisoners, which means they may have been evacuated by the Marines, but the more interesting outcome to me personally would be if they had escaped alongside Perona and Gecko Moria, as Moria was shown to have several members of the Rock's pirates among his collection of zombies back on Thriller Bark. Which brings us to Gansui, the pirate smuggler. This is perhaps the reveal I was most excited for, as you could say that I've been waiting for this for nearly 20 years, and that's because we first saw this character back during the Thriller Bark arc, where he was better known as General Zombie number 889. He was first shown rising from the ground in panels alongside other Rock's pirate members, such as Captain John, and a 4-armed gunman who we recently learned in the Volume 112 SBS was Gil Bastar, the protagonist from one of Oda's early works before One Piece titled Wanted, putting him in the same category as a character like Ryuma, who was in Oda's previous work Monsters. Now back in Thriller Bark, it was shown that Ganzui's corpse had been modified to give him the legs of an elephant. We last saw him during the God Valley flashback amongst that lineup of all the Rock's pirates, and he along with Gil were the only two that were yet to have been named. Ganzui was not even shown in the upper half of that spread, while we did see the four-armed Gil amongst them, albeit toward the back behind Kaido. Ganzui and Marlin are also the only two in this group without future epithets, and it makes sense since Ganzui was no longer alive in the present day pre-time skip, but I guess it also means that Marlin might not be long for the world either. Of course, the God Valley incident was 10 years after this point in the flashback, so it seems we still have a ways to go in terms of recruitment. Between then and now, they would pick up the former Empress of Amazon Lily, Gloriosa, Big Mom, Streusen, Kaido, Captain John, and many more. And the reason for Rox being here is to recruit Harold to his crew, all in preparation for his big plan. We learned that Full of Lead was originally an island where various nations would send criminals to die, but sometime around 48 years ago, the prisoners found a large supply of gold under the island, and with the help of the underworld, the prisoners turned the island into a settlement and found themselves in extreme wealth. This seems to have been a problem for the world government, and it appears they worked out a deal with Rox to take down the big threats inhabiting Pirate Island and give the island and the criminals to the government, or so they think, as in actuality, the real plan is to just take charge of Pirate Island, and from what we know about the story, it seems that Rox is largely successful. The chapter ends fast forwarding to 4 years later, with his crew having been formally established as they all sail toward Full of Lead. Now, I have to wonder if they'll meet more of the crew on the island, particularly Kaido, as 44 years ago was when he was first recruited. Perhaps that scene with Whitebeard was actually taking place on this day, and Kaido was already there. It's also interesting that we may be skipping ahead beyond Big Mom's recruitment, as she seemed to have already been on the crew when Kaido was recruited 44 years ago, but I suppose it's also quite possible that she's actually recruited during this raid on Full of Lead, and Kaido arrives to the island at a later point in that same year. I'm also suspecting that Captain John may have already been on the island at this point, perhaps even claiming original ownership of the gold and the island, as this could be the fabled Captain John's treasure that we've heard about for so long. We first learned of it back during the Jaya arc, as Buggy was seen searching for it on an island that also had a rock formation in the shape of a skull. We would later on learn in the Volume 49 SBS that the zombie from Thriller Bark was indeed the same Captain John, and that he was killed by his crew after trying to keep the treasure for himself. We would go on to learn in Chapter 527 that the armband Luffy got after Thriller Bark held the key to finding Captain John's treasure, and more recently, during that brief flashback to God Valley, we learned that the government had taken treasure from Pirate Island, which is why the rocks were there in the first place. While the crew argued over who would take it, John claimed that it was his treasure. So the way I see it, it could be that they end up recruiting John, Rox will claim the island for himself, the government will not take kindly to being betrayed by Rox's crew, and then try to take the treasure back, leading to the events of God Valley, where John will die by his own crew, and the Rox pirates disband. The interesting part in all of this is that while this chapter mentions that it was gold that was found on the island, the way the Rox pirates talk about it at God Valley, particularly Kaido and Big Mom, they make it sound as if devil fruits have also been involved, so we'll have to see where that goes. All of this also just goes to show you how much the world government is willing to work with criminals for their own gain. Even someone like Rox, who ambushed the Reverie, kidnapped 5 kings, threatened the Emu, and even killed an admiral. This puts into perspective why they were so willing to work with Blackbeard despite everything, and why he feels like the government would be willing to entertain his request to make Full of Lead into an affiliated nation. Now with the big plan laid out, Xebec asks Harold again to join him, but the king refuses. The pose he takes here is very reminiscent of Blackbeard's appearance on that 4 Emperors color spread from chapter 1054. Xebec also mentions that no authority in the world lasts forever, which echoes Doflamingo's words from the chapter when Emu was introduced that power has a short shelf life. While making an enemy of the entire world does not sound useful to Harold, who has his own ambitions of connecting Elbaf to all the outside countries, it does inspire a young Loki who has been listening in on this conversation, giving the hope to continue on. Of course, we would soon find out that not even Rox cares for him, despite Rox being Loki's Shanks-like figure, but the aftermath of that is for another chapter. This was an incredibly long one, and I'm so hyped for the next chapter. I know we're on break next week, so it'll be a bit of a wait, but let me know what you thought about all of these insane lore reveals and connections down in the comments. As always, you can find all of my manga breakdowns in the playlist in the description, and if you've made it this far into the video, thank you so much for watching. Stay safe, and I hope to see you in the next one.